Hi, everybody. So to start off this unit, we're going to be looking at some themes of major world history pre-1200 CE. So the very first theme we're going to look at is government and political foundations pre-1200. So let's get started. One of the first major things in this course is understanding how historians mark time. So you'll notice in your textbook that they do not use the term BC or AD anymore. Historians have deemed that to be kind of too Eurocentric. So now the new marker of time is BCE, or before Common Era. So it's the same thing as BC, it's just now it's more inclusive to everyone's history. And then CE, which means Common Era. So that's something when you start writing in this class and doing more reading, I do expect you to use those time markers. We're going to start by looking at some of the earliest points in what we know of human history. So we start out with the Paleolithic era, which when you translate it, it literally means Old Stone Age, which is around 2.6 million to 12,000 BCE, so a very, very long time ago. And then you've got the Neolithic era, which is New Stone Age. So you'll see the word neo a lot in this course, and neo just means new. And that takes place from around 12,000 to 3,500 BCE. So this is the hunters and gatherers stage of human history. You'll notice here I've got a picture here at the bottom for Paleolithic people versus Neolithic people. You'll find that one of the main differences is Paleolithic people are your traditional hunters and gatherers, and then the Neolithic people are the ones that are going to learn how to farm. The early Paleolithic people, they would travel in small groups, usually around 50 people, and they're all going to be kinship based, which means that you're going to be traveling with people that you're related to. You're going to have a council of elders that is going to rule over you. So there's not usually one specific leader, but it's going to be, a group of the oldest people in your community. And the Paleolithic people are going to be largely egalitarian. So what I mean by that is that they're going to have a pretty equal society amongst men and women, and there's not necessarily like socioeconomic groups yet because there's no such thing as money. What you see is that everybody's role in that small kinship group is so important to survival that everyone is kind of treated equally because their role is so valued in the community. One thing that you will see is that once people do learn how to farm and the Neolithic Revolution, as we call it, happens and people settle down in one place, that's when you do start seeing a lot of inequality between the genders, between different socioeconomic levels. And that's when you see lots of power structures set up, because now you have something, that you value, you're trying to protect. And the more you have, the more powerful you are. So that's where you start to see kind of single rulers developing. So after people start learning how to farm during the Neolithic Revolution, we see the very first large groups of civilization start popping up. And you'll notice they're all kind of around the same region on the map. They're all kind of right there along the equator, which just kind of suggests to most historians that these regions were just the most available farming land to develop at the time. They're going to have similar climates that are going to lend really well to farming some of the earlier crops, which are usually things like wheat and barley, things that are going to really sustain you. And so during these river valleys that we have here, the very first ones, they're going to start having very complicated and complex political orders. This is where we start to see the first written legal codes. Like one great example of this is Hammurabi's Code. You're going to have that singular ruler that's going to claim usually some kind of legitimacy from God. So they're going to have the divine right to rule, so I am in charge because the gods want me to be in charge kind of logic. They're going to be able to enforce their own laws that they've created using their large militaries. And they're typically going to rule very large populations of people. So we're talking like tens of thousands to even sometimes 1 million people. So these are very large areas. Some examples of these first legal codes, I think the most well-known one is probably Hammurabi's Code. So it's one of the earliest written legal codes in Mesopotamia. And his punishments are very literal. So if you've ever heard the saying an eye for an eye, that comes directly from the Code of Hammurabi. And that's actually a picture of me next to the Code of Hammurabi at the Louvre Museum, which was really, really cool. Some of the other major codes that'll develop Another example of a code that's going to develop is one from China called the Tang Code. So that's going to happen during the Qin Dynasty. And they're going to use lots of influences from the philosophies that they follow, like legalism and Confucianism. So one of the big things that comes out of that is the concept of that you don't have lawyers, but you have judges that are going to investigate whatever's being put in front of them. So that idea that you are not necessarily guilty upon arrival. We've also got another example called the 12 Tables, which is going to be the Roman law code, and they get into lots of some of the things that we start to see in our society. So the idea that your duty as a citizen is to uphold the law, and then like trial by jury is one of the a Roman idea. And then finally, the Edicts of Ashoka, so one of the earliest Indian legal codes that we can find, incorporates a lot of Buddhist philosophies in that one. So you can see religion or world philosophies really play a large part in how we develop our law codes, which I think is something that we can definitely identify with, in our world today, looking at different cultures. And using religion as well as these law codes is another great way that governments are going to maintain their use of power over time. Moving on to the classical era. So we call it the classical era just because of the time period it's a part of. So 600 BCE to 600 CE is known as the classical era, and that's where you've got Greece and Rome are really big. So they're known as classical civilizations. So looking at Greece specifically, you see two really important government styles come out of Greece. The first is going to come out of Athens, and that's going to be the direct democracy idea. So the idea that every citizen gets a vote. And the way they used to do that is they would have baskets with different colored rocks. And so if you were voting yes, you would use the white rock. If you're voting no, you would use the black rock. And then they would tally votes that way, which is really interesting. So Athens moves towards a democracy around somewhere between 600 to 400 BCE. On the other hand, Sparta, which is another Greek city-state, is going to develop very differently. So Greece is very mountainous. And because of that, people were very isolated from each other. So while they spoke the same language and they practiced the same religion, they were really left to their own devices, and their cultures developed very differently. So while Athens is a lot about Greek learning and art, Sparta is going to be the opposite, and they're going to be very militaristic. Sparta is going to be an oligarchy, so they're ruled by a small group of people, like noble people usually. They have a very large slave population that they use to do a lot of their labor, called the helots, which just literally means the captured people. And they don't really have their own trade or industry, so they take things from each other. Athens and Sparta have this long rivalry where they're trying to decide who's better. They have this big war called the Peloponnesian War, which really weakens both of them. And then they end up getting taken over by Alexander the Great anyways, and his father. So really doesn't matter. Moving on to Persia. So Persia actually, I feel like doesn't get enough credit throughout history because they came up with a lot of ideas that people are going to copy and take as their own. So Persia has one of the largest land-based empires. It's known as the Achaemenid Empire. And they're the first to come up with the idea of kind of using decentralized power. So they're going to divide their empire into 23 satrapies. And a satrapy is really just like a state almost. So they have 23 states and governors that are going to be appointed, by the king, by the ruler. And they actually, when they take over places, they draw a lot out of local people to be the officials in those areas. So if you were going to get taken over by somebody during the classical era, Persia is definitely who you would want because they let the local people keep practicing their own religions. They let them keep their own customs. All they ask is that you pay taxes and acknowledge the Persian government. So it's a pretty good deal overall. One thing that is notable from them is that they don't really use religion, as a means to keep power. Their religion is actually called Zoroastrianism. And it's not a conversion religion. So they're not actively recruiting people to join it, which is one of the ways most people keep power. So you'll see that Persia was able to amass this large empire, but they're not able to keep it for that long. Moving over to China, we're going to talk about them in the classical era really quick. So there's two different Chinese dynasties that'll be in place during this time, the Qin Dynasty and the Han Dynasty. So the Qin Dynasty is actually one of the shortest lived dynasties in Chinese history. Usually a dynasty lasts about 300 to 400 years. And as you can see, this one didn't even last 40. So one of the things the Qin Dynasty is really known for is their harsh legalist policies. So they definitely tried to rule with an iron fist. They used forced labor systems to connect and extend the Great Wall. They estimate almost 100,000 people died during construction because of that. They burned books and suppressed Confucian scholars from the previous government. And they're known for making this vast terracotta army to protect the Qin emperor. So you might see that in a museum. They're actually spread out all over the world now. They are definitely an empire, or not an empire, but a dynasty that you should take note of as using kind of all the wrong policies. And obviously the people didn't like them that much because they didn't last for very long. The Han Dynasty is the one that comes next, and as you can see, that one lasts about 400 years, and they're really going to be known as the classical age of China. So they're the ones that establish the Confucian education system. They're looking to create a lot of harmony within the empire, and they also are going to do something that's really interesting and key here. They're going to use a large bureaucracy to run their empire, and they're going to use civil service exams to do that. So people have to take a test and pass it before they can work in the government to ensure they have the best quality people working there. And you didn't just get your job because your uncle works in the government. So it's really good. They also established the Silk Road trade during this time. So we see lots of examples of Rome trading with the Han Dynasty on the Silk Road. China's a really interesting case because they have what is called the Mandate of Heaven. So how do you keep power in China? They go through this exact same power cycle every single dynasty. So we're going to talk about 6 other dynasties throughout the rest of this course, and the same thing happens every time. So you start here at the top where it says new ruler, new dynasty. They have the Mandate of Heaven, or the right to rule by the gods. There's usually a time of great prosperity right after this starts, and you see a population increase, which is great. So things are good, the economy's good. And then over time, you start to see corruption setting in. People aren't following those civil service exams anymore. The government's becoming corrupt. You start to see decline in the empire. The economy's doing poorly. And then some kind of natural disaster will happen. So think like floods, famine, an earthquake, something like that. And the people will take that as a sign that the government has lost the Mandate of Heaven, and someone has to, try to overthrow them. So then a civil war starts where you've got multiple groups usually fighting for power. And so whoever wins this fight is the one that is said to have gained the Mandate of Heaven, or, the right to rule. And so this exact same cycle is going to happen many times throughout Chinese history. So next, we're going to move over to India and talk a little bit about them in the classical age. So the majority of what we know as India now, like the unified India, is going to happen around 322 BCE under the ruler Chandragupta, who's going to use the Persian political model and divide it into basically kind of like smaller states. He's going to help develop the postal system there. And then later on, his grandson Ashoka is going to set up a lot of public works. So he is going to build roads and rest stop for travelers and really promote trade. And so when you see big public works like that being put in, like roads and things that are going to help people, like everyday people, you know that the empire is in kind of a good spot. So then moving on, the next big dynasty in India is the Gupta dynasty. And they'll be together until around 320 CE. And then they're overthrown by the Huns. One thing that you see is that it's very hard for people to unite the whole subcontinent of India. And we don't see very many examples of that until much later in history. Okay, we're going to do a quick summary of the Roman Republic and then the Roman Empire. So the Roman Republic was from 509 BCE to 27 BCE. And it's going to be really heavily influenced by the Greek city-states, specifically Athens. So when you think about Roman culture, the biggest things you think about are probably like the art and the gods and everything. But most of that stuff they just took from Greece and then renamed it something Roman. They do, however, introduce some very interesting political reforms. So they create their own constitution, which is kind of a first that we see in history, to help govern them. They have 3 branches of government to help balance things so that no one person can get too powerful. For example, their version of a president or the consul only serves in year-long terms, and then you can only be the consul so many times throughout your life. The Roman Republic is also really the first time we see that representative democracy that's not a direct democracy like in Rome. So, in this case, they have senators who are making these laws and voting on things. And that's where we get a lot of our US ideas about representative democracy from the Roman Republic. So that all changes, of course, when one person decides that they need to stay the leader for a longer period of time. And so that person is Julius Caesar, who you've probably heard of. And so Caesar decides to name himself dictator for life, but that does not last long because he is assassinated pretty soon after he says that. And his nephew Octavian actually becomes really the first true emperor of the new Roman Empire. At first, Rome found that you can really get a lot done when there's only one person making all the calls and you're not arguing everything in the Senate all the time. So they had what's called the Pax Romana, which means time of Roman peace, where there's lots of stability, there's a lot of continuity and trades flourishing. So it's a great time to be in Rome. But then over time, you start to get leaders, of course, that are not as great, and you get some pretty terrible leaders, actually, which is going to result in the empire splitting in two in 284. They basically just decided it was too large to rule over. We need to split it in half. And, one person's going to take the East, one person's going to take the West, and we'll be just kind of like 2 Roman empires. So what ends up happening is that the West Roman Empire, the part, where Rome actually is, Rome and Europe, that is all going to fall because they actually get cut off from all major trade going on in the world and they become very weak. So they lose their seat of power, they get invaded. And that's what starts the Middle Ages in Europe around 500 or so. And then the eastern part, they still stay thriving. The city of Constantinople is one of the biggest trading cities, in the world at that point. They move a lot of their power there. And they continue on, and they're just called the Byzantine Empire after that. And the Byzantines will last until the 400s. Okay, so that was a lot of stuff about a lot of different places. So let's kind of just recap some of the big ideas we should be seeing here about early governments before 1200. So you see lots of government structures grow in size as populations increased. We started with hunters and gatherers that really only had a small council of elders that didn't have, too many rules. And then as we built up throughout time, there's more and more systems put in place. We see the development of early governments putting in things like legal codes. They're using armies and social structures and religion to help them keep order in their societies. And these imperial leaders usually have total power and control and just rule as they see fit. Some of the only examples of that not happening are in Athens and Rome, the Roman Republic, where they had some sort of democracy involved. Rulers are always going to justify their power in this early time period by saying they have divine right to rule, the right from God to rule. Some places will allow their citizens to say in their government and elected officials. We see that in Persia as well as Athens and Rome. But overall, usually there is that one head person, controlling everything else. All right, well, that's it for today. Thank you for watching our first theme of government and politics in early history.